Thank you, Louise. Welcome. Good morning. It's Friday. Yay! This is the Civic Lab and Beyond, Civic Engagement through Resources and Programming. So hopefully you're all in the right spot.
Louise, can we get the...
Oh, perfect.
Yay.
Okay.
Hello.
My name is Amy Holcomb, and I'm the Experiential Learning Supervisor at Skokie Public Library, where I manage our STEAM learning space, the Boombox, and the Youth Computer and Digital Media Lab, and I also develop and facilitate hands-on learning for all ages.
Hi, I'm Amy Kuster. I'm the Youth and Family Program Supervisor, which means I coordinate all of our public events for kids birth through grade 5 and their families, and then obviously also work on our civic engagement stuff. That's why we're here.
My name is Mimosa Shah, and I'm the Adult Program Coordinator. I develop, evaluate, and manage details for adult programs. These are all public programs, and I also collaborate with a wide staff who are wonderful and who contribute a lot of their expertise and knowledge to our various community initiatives. And then we also work together on civic engagement opportunities, such as the Civic Lab.
So the pictures you're seeing of us on the slides are from this really cool Instagram initiative that our library has done called A Book That Changed Your Life. And staff members pick a book that has changed their life, have their photo taken with it, share a little bit about it. So steal that idea. Everybody, go forth. Yes.
Okay, so I just want to make sure all of our locations have gotten handouts. For those of you video conferencing, can you just give a thumbs up if you got the handouts?
I did email them to everybody yesterday. So
Okay.
hopefully they should have them. If not, I can email them again.
Great. All right, and everyone in here, you're good? Awesome. So for today, first we are going to start off with a quick activity for you all. That's a pair and share. It'll help set the stage for civic engagement resource building and programming. Then we're going to spend the majority of our time discussing the library's role in civic engagement, looking at what Skokie has done with the Civic Lab and other civic engagement programming and resources, and also looking at strategies for identifying relevant topics and how to reach different audiences in your community. We'll end the session with a group exercise to help you ideate civic engagement opportunities for your community, focusing on core questions to work through. If you don't have the handout, that's okay, because we have a slide with all the questions for that one. And then we also have several times during the presentation where we will pause for questions. So as Louise mentioned, please write them down. We'll get to them, don't worry. And we'll also build in time at the end to wrap up any formulating questions you might have throughout, and also have some time for reflection. All right. So let's start with our pair and share. Using your handout, and also, oops, nope, we don't have a slide, just kidding. So what is a program that your library has offered in the past few months that has tied in some way to current events or topics in the news? If you don't have an example, you can think about what you would like to see in these terms. You can use your handout to take notes during your conversation with your neighbor. After about 5 minutes, we'll take some time to hear from you. So please do it, because we're going to ask you for some ideas, okay? So we will reconvene at 10:12.
Right.
So
Drawing
put back in the fingers.
Exactly.
I'd love to hear your ideas.
It was like,
I'd also love to hear your ideas in Peoria,
Right, yeah.
in Lenox, and Cole Valley. The question was about what programs your library has offered in the past few months that's tied in some way to current events, topics in the news, whether you had one that currently happened or you're thinking of doing one. We'd love to hear some of those experiences. So who would like to volunteer some of their ideas or some of the things that have happened? Yes.
I've been facilitating the Great Decisions discussion program. I don't know if you folks are aware of that. It's put out by the Foreign Policy Association. They cover 8 topics annually. The emphasis is foreign policy, but of course U.S. involvement in it. So you can purchase a briefing booklet, which is about $30 now. You pre-order in October, $25. There's a DVD that comes with the booklet that's about $40. It will have a half-hour segment of a speaker embellishing what's in the reading material. If you go to the Foreign Policy Association website, they have updated additional readings and materials. You can really delve deeply into these topics. I've also started in the last several years, kind of take the heat off myself because I really don't do a lot of foreign policy stuff on my own. And you don't need to be the expert to facilitate. It's like any group discussion. You're kind of keeping them on track, trying to keep things from getting overly heated sometimes. I brought in speakers for free, like from the local community colleges. We have the last topic this year is global health policy. So I found someone from University of Illinois, Chicago, who runs their Global Health Institute. She's going to come out and talk. So it's been a really good program.
And where are you from?
I'm from Indian Prairie Public Library.
Awesome. So, addendum, when you are sharing, if you could also share which library you're from, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to share or at our member sites?
should be going.
Is Cole Valley live?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. This is, hi. This is Rock Island Library, and we had a series of programs last fall, and 2 of them were on pretty hot topics. One was on journalism and being an informed news consumer. The other was on data mining and really all of the things that you reveal in the process of being online. And then just recently we had a program on food waste.
Wow, those sound very timely and of the moment as well. Thank you for sharing. And I know someone here was going to share. Yes?
Yeah, I'm from River Forest, and we recently had a presentation on climate change.
Okay.
It was very well attended. And also our village has set up a sustainability commission, and so they're actually coming in this weekend to speak to the public about what the village is doing for green living. So excited about that, yeah.
It's great to have that local connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm Stephanie from Schaumburg, and Megan is also from Schaumburg, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on anything. But for February, we did kind of a passive display, and so you walked up our second story, our stairs to our second story, and it was a big poster, and it just had the facts of what exactly Black Lives Matters is. And then we just had 2 boxes that said, how has race affected your daily life in Schaumburg? And then you had tokens, you could vote yes or no. And then we also had some comment cards that people could sort of more in-depth questions that people could fill out. And this was kind of our first foray into one of these things, so we didn't actually do anything with the information. We kind of just had it out there so people could experience it and see some facts, and we had a lot of people participate. And I liked the passive idea because it was kind of hard to get people maybe to go to a whole program about it, but this was just a little like screenshot where they could do it in, their 20 seconds walking up the stairs, so.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else at our member sites, or was there somebody here?
Something else that I did that was
Hi. Oh.
really
Yes. We'll get to you. I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead. Somebody at one of the sites.
New Lenox.
Hi. We're in New Lenox. My name is Tony. I am an academic librarian, and one of my colleagues, her husband works at Rail, so sometimes I look for some of the programming. And the reason I came to the project was I recently taught a one-shot for a communication professor who has a civics assignment where he has his students pick a not-for-profit tied to an issue, and they do research on it and build a bibliography, and then also visit and get somewhat engaged with both the issue through the institutions. So that prompted my interest, and I've done smaller assignments in other places I've been at in LA and Utah. One of the things that I'm involved in at Moraine is I went to a couple of the full-time librarians and full-time staff. I'm part-time and a consultant in diversity as well. I'm a part-time librarian. And I went to them and asked them, were they interested in doing a diversity podcast around some issues at Moraine Valley Community College? And they said yes. So we created a vision statement and met a couple of times, and then we wanted to pick our segment, and we decided that we would focus on the Arab and Muslim population because Moraine Valley has a very strong community around the school, as well as the student and faculty population there. So we're focusing on student groups, faculty, as well as we have a mosaics project going on that's bringing residency artists to Moraine for just enlightenment for the school community and the surrounding communities. And so we've been interviewing and creating small content to launch our first season, hopefully in the next few weeks, of what we're calling MVCC POV, Voices from the Valley. So those are just some of the nuggets around either getting civically engaged internally or externally that I've come across in my couple of years at MVCC.
Okay.
That's awesome.
That is fantastic. So I've heard some wonderful responses in a wide variety of ways that each of your libraries has found a way to respond to community questions and needs with regards to current events, whether it's a Great Decisions book or discussion series, to a podcast, to having your particular municipality come in to talk about the initiatives they're taking on being more green-minded, if you will. So I think to myself that libraries have been doing this kind of thing for a long time in terms of being responsive to their communities and trying to provide resources and opportunities to learn more about a topic. And so historically, libraries have acted as these sites of engagement for a long, long time. And there have been publications more recently within libraries in which we talk about the ways that we've sought community input in our spaces and our planning. And this process encourages a more multi-tiered approach to understanding how we embed ourselves in the community, and at the same time try to engage others in the processes that help to govern where we are today, whether that's governing our society, and more on a micro level, it could be governing the way our schools work, governing the way our water system works. So I see ourselves as catalysts for civic engagement. Public libraries have become invested in giving patrons the opportunity to obtain useful resources. We are people that can provide all of the opportunity to really delve deep into a topic. We can also provide people with ways to determine how the sources they receive are verifiable and evidence-based. We've done this for many years at different desks. And with the Civic Lab pop-up model, what we try to do is we try to replicate the idea that you have all these resources possibly available to you, and you, the consumer, you, the patron, are participating in this deliberation and decision-making and really taking the time to learn how to take responsible social and political action if you indeed feel compelled. The choice is always left to the patron. On the other hand, as librarians and library workers, we are here to provide people with ways to convene, as well as ways to enter the dialogue and the discourse around different topics. Public participation really builds upon the capacity to go from being a spectator to an actor. And so one of the things I do want to say as well, that at Skokie Public Library, we've built upon these initiatives over a course of time, and more specifically on the Civic Lab,
over a period of time. It didn't happen overnight, and my colleagues here will be talking a little more about its genesis, but we've increasingly become more involved with encouraging patrons to consider ways that they could be more active in their civic lives. So we do it through displays, we've done it through various programming. In November of 2016, we partnered with the Aspen Institute, in which we developed a program called What Every American Should Know, where we gathered different policy experts, including Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, to talk about what are the seminal texts that every American should be aware of. This led to a 2-hour discussion. Patrons started talking about what comprises the canon of what every person should be aware of, whether it's an event, whether it's a certain text, whether it's certain people, and more importantly, what is our baseline for required knowledge and how that changes over time and through the ways that we have taken cues from various elected officials as well as different movement leaders. So, of course, over the past year and a half, we've seen the need to provide patrons with more reputable information and resources, and fake news, alternative facts, other phrases have made it so much harder for the public to sift and accurately pinpoint what is news. And so we feel that as library workers, librarians, it is our role to be able to guide, to show people, hey, you're interested in InfoWars, okay. Tell me how you find that information useful in your life. How do you know to trust this source? How are some of the ways that you have been able to verify this source in other people and other institutions? Have they also reviewed this information as well? That's another way to get into more of a dialogue as opposed to being the sole authoritarian institution that says, well, no, that's not right. So, yeah, absolutely. We are here looking at civic engagement as a way to make more intelligent decisions about what we see, what we hear, and experience today.
So we've talked about the Civic Lab in particular and civic engagement more broadly at a couple of different venues up to this point, and usually after giving that kind of background on the library as a convener for civic engagement, this is where people will usually have the questions of like, yeah, but aren't libraries neutral? So we've inserted this slide where we are definitively saying libraries aren't neutral. So a question, show of hands, how many of your libraries adhere to the Library Bill of Rights? So yeah, I think that's everybody. So if you adhere to that document, then your library is not neutral. So neutral means having no position on anything, but libraries historically have stood for access to information, and more specifically, good information. We've kind of got into this social false dichotomy where neutral is assumed to be the exact same thing as nonpartisan, and absolutely, a public library, an academic library can, and in my opinion, should be nonpartisan, but that's not the same thing as being neutral. So we're approaching the Civic Lab, our entire civic engagement initiatives from this perspective that at the core of what libraries do is information and reputable information. And so that's what we're tying back to every time we're thinking about a topic we're going to explore, a program that we're going to offer. Libraries stand for information, access, credibility, curation, and also informed decision making so that patrons are able to not only be able to get information, have confidence in the credibility of that information, but then to utilize that information to make decisions for themselves. So, one of the big questions we get is, well, can the library offer a program on climate change? Like, isn't that something that, is up to the person? I always use this as an example. It's a bad example because science says climate change is real. So let's say another thing, like discussing gun violence. Like, there are lots of potential perspectives on gun violence. We also know as libraries that there's a lot of not credible information out there. So when we'll have, very rarely do we have patrons bring this up, but when we have other libraries say like, how could you talk about gun violence in the library? Like, Are you trying to get people to believe a certain thing, to have a certain perspective? And that's absolutely not the case. So we are recognizing that gun violence is a topic in the news, in the cultural zeitgeist right now. And we're recognizing that people have a lot of questions and are running the risk of making their decisions, their opinions, based on erroneous information. And that's the place where a library, adhering to the Library Bill of Rights, believing in information access and credibility, can jump into the ring and say, all right, we know this is something that you're seeing come across the, on the news ticker on the bottom of whatever TV channel you prefer to watch. It's not up to us to say, this is what you should believe, but rather what we're saying is these are some really good sources. These are sources that have been discredited, and here's why. Here are a variety of viewpoints on a topic, really approaching civic engagement from the perspective that only through having good information can people make up their own minds. And we've actually had patrons who, as they stop by our events, will say, oh, well, why is the library doing this? It doesn't necessarily fit the model of what we think of traditional library services. And we had one woman who said, oh, I get it now. If you have good information, you can make up your own mind. If you have bad information, someone else is making up your mind for you. And think about that for a second. If all of the news resources that a patron has access to are ones that are actively biased, trying to convince someone of a certain point of view, and they don't have the time or the resources or the recognition of how to expand their worldview, whoever made that one news source is making up their mind for them. And so we're approaching civic engagement from this perspective that libraries are not neutral, we stand for information, and we're going to help our patrons come to the best conclusions for themselves based on the best information that is available. All right. So we kind of started down this path about 2 years ago. If you'll remember 2016, there was an election that year. And kind of in the lead up to that election, we had a lot of people in Skokie talking about issues that were important to them. We had staff who were particularly keyed into tracking certain policy topics or cultural issues, social issues. We had patrons saying things like, oh, I keep hearing about climate change, but I'd like more information. Skokie has a rich history of immigration to the United States, and so immigration was definitely a topic of interest for the community. And so kind of that confluence of events of the upcoming election, these topics that were in the news, kind of a growing plethora of resources that maybe or maybe were not the most reliable. We really started in our department at Skokie, which is called Learning Experiences, kind of like programming. We really started talking about, okay, how do we support our patrons in this way? We can certainly offer some one-off programs on major topics as we see them, but if your library is like our library, our planning schedule is 4 to 6 months ahead, and so it's really hard to anticipate and respond to those immediately timely news topics. So what we started thinking about was how can we help patrons feel like they have access to information and resources on some of these major topics. And the first thing that we developed was the Civic Lab, which at that point in time was a static space in a kind of a little bit dark corner of our library where we used to put all of the music scores before they were reintegrated into nonfiction. And we were able to utilize this space from the end of August basically till Election Day of 2016 to explore 6 main topics. And that created what we call the Civic Lab Boutique. So here's an image of what that boutique looked like. We had the support of our administration, of our graphics team to develop kind of some branding, some color scheme. So if you're like, why on earth did they pick this bright orange for the slideshow? That's why. So what we did, we utilized this space, and this was our first iteration of ongoing civic engagement in the library, and it had a couple of key pieces. One of the biggest pieces, and it's one that we have not continued since the boutique was replaced by all of our Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah materials, what was a micro collection. So for this Civic Lab Boutique, we picked 6 topics: Black Lives Matter, climate change, income inequality, immigration, LGBTQI, and reproductive justice. So those were 6 topics that we identified based on conversations we'd been hearing amongst the community as things that were particularly important to them. And we purchased micro collections for each of those 6 areas, which included 2 adult titles, 2 young adult titles, and 2 children's titles on each topic. When we were approaching this, and this piece has really remained central to how we think about civic engagement in the Civic Lab, we weren't looking for a pro and a con. In choosing those 2 resources for adults, say, we weren't looking for nope. We weren't looking for, there's actually, okay. So we weren't looking for reproductive justice. Women should have access to abortion. Abortion is bad. That's a very reductive argument. And we don't need to perpetuate that. There's plenty of that everywhere else. What we were looking for in reproductive justice, for example, was a couple of different perspectives. So one of the books that we had looked at women in particular who opted for motherhood versus those who did not. That's a choice. It doesn't have anything to do with abortion. That's kind of how we reduce the idea of reproductive justice. Now we think pro-life, pro-choice, and that's it. But these topics are so much broader. So our goal for resources was and continues to be having some clear perspectives, but not looking for that opposing viewpoints mentality. So we had micro collections on those 6 topics. We also had resource handouts on each of those 6 topics, and you can still access all of these from our website. And those resource handouts included the names of those books in the micro collections, some additional reading suggestions from the library's collections, some key terms and definitions to help folks who maybe were just encountering a topic for the first time, some conversation starters, things to get people to reflect a little bit on the topic and maybe think about things from a perspective different than they had in the past. Those conversation starters also showed up in our space. And we had this up for about, 9-10 weeks. And so every week and a half, almost 2 weeks, we changed the featured topic in the boutique. So we went alphabetically because after all, we are librarians. So we started for a week and a half, had all of the Black Lives Matter resources front and center. We had these cubes that we utilized to ask some actual questions there. You can kind of see that orange table in the middle with cubes as seats, and then a cube on the table that had some of those questions. We also always had a voting question that tied into the topic at hand. So one, and you'll see this on the next slide in a little while, or you saw it already a couple slides ago. Sure, go back to. Has the Black Lives Matter movement changed how you think about racism in Skokie? Very similar to what Schaumburg just shared, they did with their display.
I think we took our idea from your idea.
Cool. None of this is proprietary. If you think it would be useful in your community, use it. We also have permission to say, if you like the name Civic Lab, go for it. Yay. Sharing. So yeah, that's what our Civic Lab Boutique started out with. And the reason we're starting here, and then we're going to take some questions in a minute, is because we don't actually do the boutique anymore. This was a 2-month thing. We thought we would try it out, see what the response was, see what we could learn, and we did learn some stuff. I'll get to that in a minute. But then kind of reevaluate and see what the community response was. And as you know, there has been even more talk about civic engagement after that election in 2016. And so that really for us was the impetus to say, all right, this was our seed project, and now we're going to think about what we've learned and then eventually evolve into whatever our next steps became. So a couple of the key things we learned from the Civic Lab Boutique, and then we'll take some time for some questions. So if you have any, get ready. We learned first and foremost that facilitation seems to be really helpful when it comes to patrons engaging in civic engagement. This sort of a little bit more passive self-serve space, even with conversation questions or with that voting. Part of it could be that it was, like I said, a little bit darker corner of the library, not necessarily in a common footpath. But we found that people would maybe come up, look, browse the books, take a handout, but they weren't really engaging, and they certainly weren't having conversations with one another in this space, with the exception of times when we had a staff member down there. Because then a staff member can utilize all of those great library facilitation skills that we've all developed to actually have a conversation. So facilitation, we found, is absolutely key. We found that the resource handouts were a real benefit to patrons and also to staff who might get questions about, what is the boutique? What are they trying to do there? What is the Civic Lab? So handouts are something that we've absolutely continued on through all iterations of what we've done thus far. And then last but not least, this idea that visuals are really powerful. When there was something eye-catching, because it was neon colors, or because we had images to accompany some of the questions or the key definitions. Maybe, for income inequality, there was a chart. I really like charts that looked at, the wealth gap over time in the United States. Like those kind of visuals we learned really draw people in and get them thinking in a different way than just like seeing a big question or a big topic in front of them do. So those were some of the 3 big things that we learned from our boutique. We're fortunate that we had the collections money to be able to do those micro collections for those initial 6 topics. Like I said, we've not continued that practice, but have really carried on through facilitation, handouts, and visuals. And you'll hear about that in the next little bit about what we've been doing in the last year and a half. But let's take a couple of minutes, and I want to see if there are any questions at this time. So if we can flip back to see our satellite sites.
Yeah. And while we're doing this Q&A, Brian's going to try and fix those lines.
Cool. All right. So I have a question in the room. Yes.
Yes, I'm Stavrila from Indian Trails. I wanted to hear more about how you avoid the pro-con and opposing viewpoints thing. I mean,
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in there are 2 ways to think about this. So how do you avoid staff feeling like that they get to all right, well, if I look at all of the resources I've looked at so far, I need to make sure I add this other viewpoint in. But then there's also the patrons have kind of come to expect a bit of pro-con, because again, that's what the larger narrative is. You're either this or that without the recognition that there's anything in between. This is something we've definitely seen in the last little bit, and what we've ended up doing as we've brought on more team members to participate in the Civic Lab in particular, but civic engagement in general. I or one of the other initial team members will talk with them about creating their first handout and being mindful of, okay, what resources do you usually read? What perhaps are the biases of only reading those things? And here are some resources to find some additional topics or additional viewpoints to try and get at a lot of different perspectives. So a lot of times, even among staff, it's an impetus to think critically about the news or the information we tend to prefer to consume, and then widening that circle. That's not to say that if you are a Fox News person, you will check the box of not being too reductive by watching what's liberal? MSNBC, thank you. Or vice versa. Not to say so Amy is working on a handout right now for a pop-up that she's going to lead about perspectives on gun violence in America. So what she's looking at is not okay, a Second Amendment perspective versus a gun reform perspective. She's looking at, all right, police violence, school violence,
Household
violence. What?
Domestic, yeah.
Yeah, domestic. So looking at, all right, so if we have this core topic, not what are some viewpoints, but what are some different ways to tell the story. What's been really useful for me personally is that I really like podcasts, in particular podcasts like Radio Lab, or science versus, like things that actively, as part of their like exploration model, want to look at things from a lot of different perspectives. So that's been helpful. Anything else you guys want to add on that?
I often use Twitter as a source, and I know that it's been maligned in the past for many reasons, good reasons, because they don't do a good job of sifting through really toxic talk on Twitter. But on the other hand, you can really curate and create a wealth of sources and individuals, including media scholars and other journalists who are working in other types of outlets that are not as mainstream, to get other viewpoints or to get further documentation information about a topic. And I think that's one way to go about it. Also, they often are involved with a lot of podcasts and can then redirect you to sources that you wouldn't ordinarily be tapped into.
And I ask for help. I like having the opinions and analyses from my colleagues, or even just talking to friends and family about a particular topic. What have they been reading or consuming about it, and sifting through it that way? Because it's a skill that you need to build. So it does take some time. And what's great about working in a library is you have a lot of information specialists around you who can help you identify some of your weaknesses, or some things that maybe weren't as obvious to you when you were first selecting resources.
Can I just ask one more clarifying question? So for like reproductive justice, did you not put out things that were pro-life or pro-choice? You just went with the broader topics? I guess.
Yeah, good question. So for when we had the boutique, we were somewhat limited in the number of resources we specifically put out there. So like for kids, for example, what we did were things that ultimately were about consent, because that's a reproductive justice topic. So we were very mindful that if we only had 2 featured adult books, we didn't want it to be pro-choice, pro-life, because that's really not very nuanced. That said, like looking at some of the articles and things that we connected or aimed to connect people to were things that maybe were some analysis saying, like, looking beyond the pro-choice, pro-life dichotomy, and like other scholars who have done that work of saying, like, there's more to this story here. So we're typically not trying to like share as resources policy briefs where it's like, this is what this foundation says, this is what that foundation says, and then like, what do you think? Because that is still really difficult for a lot of people. Like even for us, like I'm gonna think the way that the one that I agree with more, as opposed to thinking about things from a different perspective. Yeah. Are there any questions from our satellite sites? If there are, go ahead and turn on your microphone. I don't see anybody moving for their microphone. Maybe? No? Okay. Anyone else in here? Yeah.
Could you just list those 6 areas you focused on?
Yeah.
One more time.
So the 6 areas that we focused on in the Civic Lab Boutique in 2016 were Black Lives Matter, climate change, income inequality, immigration, LGBTQI, and reproductive justice. Yep.
What is, I think every library has different demographic and what their people. You had a good positive response. Did you have people comment and say, why is the library doing this? Any kind of pushback on that type of?
Yeah, so for the boutique in particular, we didn't really have any sort of pushback. Again, I don't know if that's because a lot of people just didn't see it because it was not in a highly trafficked area. We had a couple of people who would, because this was right near our AV desk, who did go to the AV desk and say like, oh, why does the library have a thing about Black Lives Matter? And those staff were then able to like say, oh, well, this is a big topic that's in the news, and people in the community want to know more, so this is a way to know more. If we're being entirely honest, we did not give the AV desk that heads up initially, so we had to like backtrack and make sure they had that information after the first couple of people asked them. But yeah, like that's why for us it's so important to recognize the civic engagement initiatives are really based in information, because then if we do have a patron who comes up and says, oh, well, why is the library doing this with climate change? I don't think it's real. It's like, well, this is a big topic in the news, and there are lots of places covering it, some really well, some not. This is an opportunity for people to read more than they might otherwise, or listen more, or watch more, and then feel like they're really making an informed opinion. And it's, once people realize, because it does, I think, tends to be the people who are maybe working slowly toward a complaint tend to be on the more politically conservative side of the spectrum. Once a staff member is able to say, oh, this isn't about like you thinking X at the end, this is about you feeling like you have all the information that you need to have an informed opinion, then they tend to be like, oh, okay, you should include, or you should read this too. And we're like, great, thank you. Like, I'm glad to have another resource to review. So it becomes about resource sharing as opposed to like opinion volleying. Yeah. Any other questions before we move on to what we've been doing the last year and a half?
Oh, actually,
yeah.
I had one.
Go for it.
Could you said you had facilitated engagements, and can you say a little bit more about those?
Sure. So for the boutique, we had just a handful of facilitated moments. I did with late preschool, early elementary kids, where we would read one of the stories, the picture books that was included for each topic, and then talk about it. We had a little bit of facilitation from some of our teen staff and our adult staff, but usually that was just in the space for a few minutes to check up on things and ended up having a serendipitous conversation. So really all of the facilitation we've done since is a direct follow-up to the fact that we didn't facilitate enough in the boutique. So we're going to have a lot of really concrete examples of the types of facilitation as we cover the next couple of things that we've done with the Civic Lab and other civic engagement pieces. So we'll get more to that. I think that's a good time to segue. Or did anyone else have another question? All right, we're going to go ahead and segue to what we've been doing since November 2016.
Okay, so learning all those things from the boutique. The Civic Lab now exists as pop-ups, and you've been seeing a lot of pop-up images in our presentation so far. We're going to take the time to explain what all goes into that, and you can get a little bit more visual here. The tagline for the Civic Lab now is that the Civic Lab offers information and thought-provoking activities to support dialogue and engagement on issues that affect the Skokie community. So we use that as our starting point as we're coming up with ideas. These are planned, curated pop-up events. We put them in our events calendar. We have them in our events publications. Sometimes we're operating several months in advance, which doesn't always bode well with news topics, right? So we also have rapid response pop-ups that Mimosa's going to talk about in a few minutes. But these are staffed, planned events. So we have a team of Civic Lab leads. Makeup of that team is from multiple departments. So yes, we are all in learning experiences, but we also have members from our access services, which involves curation of the collection and managing the collection. We have someone from administration.
We've had adult services staff take the lead in some areas.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's not just our department, even though we primarily coordinate programs. We are trying to get input and facilitation from the whole library. And that can exist at different levels. So just because you're on this team doesn't mean that you're committed to doing every one. Generally, pop-ups will be staffed by at least 2 staff members. This is really helpful for facilitation because you can see in this picture that we are in a, maybe you can't tell, but it's in a primary walkway of the library. So you're having people coming from both sides, and it's helpful to have one person stationed on either side of your display to say, to either get the person coming from one side to be like, hey, we're doing this today, or to be a part of a discussion while other people are kind of peering and saying like, oh, what is that? So we always recommend having 2 people. The leads work on curating a handout of resources. So they're researching the topic, they're putting together different resources about that. We do have a sample handout from one of our recent pop-ups, and we try to have a variety of different resources because learners learn in different ways. So I really like podcasts too. I like to listen to things. We try to include something to listen, something to read, something to watch. We'll have a discussion prompt at the Civic Lab in the pop-up, but we also have more questions on the handout that you can take with you, because the idea is you are engaging in a discussion either with a staff member who's facilitating or hopefully with other participants from the community, and then you're taking that out into the community to share with others and to continue that discussion, all working towards having an informed opinion about a topic or expanding your knowledge about a topic. We are grateful for having support from our graphics department in having these cubes that they picked out. So we use that not just for seating like you saw in the boutique, but here it's helping display images. So Amy talked about how having visuals is really helpful. We apply that to the pop-ups as well, either with images, charts, or we'll have some sort of interactivity or an activity like a matching game, and we'll use the cubes to display part of that too. It can also serve as a handout holder, and we have a prompt up there where participants can respond via Post-it. We encourage them to also talk to one another, but some people don't want to do that, so we're like, oh, well, do you want to take a minute to respond? We have some Post-it notes. You can share your thoughts here. And those questions are not yes or no questions. They are open-ended. They're often relating back to the person. So how do you relate personally to this topic? Or what have you, one of our first pop-ups was on election night, and we asked what resources did you use to be an informed voter? And people were able to share that via Post-it that way. We do have a banner as well that you cannot see in this picture, but you can see in other pictures. And that is a symbol to say, hey, like, this is something that's happening. This is also part of the library. So what we learned when we were doing pop-up topics related to government agencies, like what is FEMA, people are real cautious. They're like, are you from the government? And we're like, no, we work at the library. Like, this is a library event. So we had T-shirts made that say Civic Lab Skokie Public Library.
Imagination.
As another visual cue to remind people that, like, no, we are your friendly librarians helping you get good resources. So to kind of sum up all those ramblings, we have some sort of display. We try to have a matching or sorting or some sort of activity, particularly when you're trying to reach younger kids, or just to make things a little bit more interactive and as like an icebreaker almost to have a larger discussion. We have a handout. The handout is also posted on our website related to the event that is also posted on our website. What am I missing?
Facilitation.
And we have at least 2 staff members. I sometimes staff pop-ups on my own when I know that it's going to be okay. I also tend to pick topics that steer towards the science realm, and I would encourage you that if you do that, you do have a second person, because people get science information from all over, and it's interesting. Yes. I think that's it. Mimosa, would you like to talk about rapid responses?
Absolutely. So we are still in the beta testing section of our rapid response pop-ups. We started this in January. And what we recognized is that even though we have these planned pop-ups, there's a lot of news that is happening so fast in the information cycle that we are trying to respond to the urgency of these events as they happen. And so as library staff, we feel like we should be able to respond and share resources when possible. And we always try our best to share good, verifiable resources. Rapid response are pop-ups that are not advertised on our calendar, and they do not have a dedicated handout developed for each of them. Instead, we use our go-to news sources handout, which some of you have grabbed a copy of or have a link to our website to get that handout. But essentially, we try to use these rapid response pop-ups as different points of engagement. We bring our banner, the Civic Lab banner that Amy mentioned, as well as a laptop, some of the cubes, that you see in this image, as well as a few materials to write with so that we can demonstrate to patrons who may not be familiar with the fundamentals of finding verifiable information. So for example, if someone comes up to us to ask about, well, geez, didn't you hear about that shooting in Parkland, Florida? What do you think of it? We'll say, there's a lot to think about, and here's some stories that have come out recently about Parkland and what has happened and how to place it in context, as opposed to necessarily saying, oh gosh, that's, obviously it's horrible, but also, oh gosh, maybe the response should be that we just get rid of everything and go to Wiccan. But anyways, instead of going to our hermetic tendencies, we try to use these rapid responses as ways to really think more about how we can find information. That whole process of trying to leave that bubble of information seeking that is cultivated so often through our social media streams, and understanding that these algorithms that we are part of are algorithms of oppression, to borrow the phrase from Safia Noble, who's written a book about it. But really thinking about how can we get beyond that, how can we get to verifiable analysis. We've only carried this format out for a few months. We've learned so far that it's flexible format. It allows us to address these current issues more frequently and without disrupting as many processes or departments or the time and work of our colleagues. Of course, we will always reach out to colleagues if they have a certain information specialty or understanding. I mean, that's always there. That's always very valid. But for these particular pop-ups, they happen once a month with just one staff member. If someone wants to contribute or be there, that's fine, but generally it's one person.
Okay, so we've talked about two different pop-ups, meaning they're out in the library. We tend to do these on our first floor where it's a little bit more of an active space versus the second floor that is a bit more quiet, though we have experimented up there. These next examples are more along the lines of programs that you would have in a room. The first is Together at the Table. We've been experimenting with Together at the Table, which is a day-long community discussion opportunity using questions inspired by the 36 questions that lead to love. So far, this event is occurring twice a year. We tend to offer it on Martin Luther King Jr. Day as part of the Day of Service and around Thanksgiving. This is happening in one of our larger meeting or program rooms where we have tables. You can see are connected the long way to provoke that idea of like this is a community conversation area. We recruit teen volunteers to help with facilitation of this event, where they are participating in the discussion, they are welcoming patrons as they walk in the door, they're getting them a cookie or a muffin or another baked good, because this is along the lines of breaking bread with your neighbor. One of the reasons why we started experimenting with this type of program was we heard through community conversations as part of the Harvard method that our community wants to know their neighbors. We don't really know what that means totally, right? But there's clearly a desire to talk to one another, and what better way to do that than in a facilitated room in the library with a baked good. So that's part of it. And the questions change up each time, so we tend to have about 6 to 8 different questions that are on the table tents that can rotate to, and sometimes you have a patron who comes in and just wants the cookie and isn't going to participate, but they're sitting next to you, so that's cool. And sometimes you'll have someone who will stay for a really long time and make a really great connection with someone else. So we've seen kind of the extremes. As we're moving forward with this, we're thinking about shortening the event so it isn't all day, because we are open 12 hours. That's a really long time. It's also a strain on staff and getting your volunteers to show up. So we want to shorten that. We're thinking of bringing it out into the open like we do with our Civic Lab pop-ups and rapid response pop-ups. We also have other pop-ups that are happening throughout the library, so our community is getting a little bit more familiar with that model and a little bit more comfortable participating too in that way. And we probably will have it either before or after some other event that is scheduled for the day. So those are some things that we're thinking about as we're moving forward. News discussion groups are relatively new as well. in this format. So these are scheduled events to inform patrons of quality news sources and how to navigate through the many news media outlets. I can benefit from this too, so I'm glad that we started offering this. We offer these discussion groups for kids, teens, and adults. The teens one is different. It's called Media Wants Your Brains. We're also experimenting with the title for the kids one to make it a little bit different. But all of these events allow us to engage in both general news literacy discussions as well as to focus in on a major news story that's relevant and timely. These discussion groups, at least for the youth and kids, will start with a brief spark talk during which the facilitating staff member gives an overview of the coverage of the news story that's up for discussion. So this is including different perspectives, how different outlets are covering it, and coverage across media formats. So radio, TV, the internet. Then the discussion portion follows a reflective listening model. Are you familiar with reflective listening? If you are, you can be like, yeah. Anyone? Okay, awesome. We have one. So reflective listening is where one participant will share their perspective at a time. So if we were participating, I would share my perspective of it. Then Amy would go. She would first repeat back and say, what I'm hearing from you is, and kind of sum up my perspective before sharing her own. So that way everyone's perspective is heard, and it kind of sets the stage where one perspective is not going to potentially dominate another. So it really helps people feel more comfortable adding to the discussion. At least that's what we're hoping for. And we encourage you to try something like that too. The teen event, Media Wants Your Brains, is facilitated by one of our teen librarians, and that is more of a game model. So he's going to start off with, again, how something is covered in the news, and then the goal for the participants is to figure out what is factual and what isn't. So it's more of a game model for that, and they get snacks.
How often do you do those?
Once a month? Yep, once a month.
So those are 4 things we've been doing in the last year and a half. Civic Lab, Popups, Rapid Response Popups, Together at the Table, News Discussion Group. What questions do you have about those events? I just heard one. How often do the news discussions sorts of things happen?
Once a month.
Once a month.
How many people attend these events?
For teens, they have a varying crowd because it's after school, so anywhere from, I would say, 4 to, I think, 12. For kids, 3. For adults?
For news discussion groups, it can be anywhere from 5 to 10.
Were the 36, you mentioned 36 questions at the table thing?
36 questions that lead to love. That's a thing.
Yeah, so the New York Times published this piece, 36 questions that lead to love. It's meant to be questions that take you deeper than like, so where are you from? What do you do? And it's things like, what's something you've always wanted to do and why haven't you done it? Like, it really gets people talking on more of a human, less of a superficial level.
It was also featured on The Big Bang Theory.
Oh.
All right.
Yeah. Do we have questions from our satellite? Yeah, New Lenox, I see ya.
I didn't have a question, but inside of that point you made about the reflective listening, that is so powerful of a tool inside of facilitation, and the more it's engaged inside of more tense type topics, the more it brings authentic engagement versus those emotional whirlwinds that happen. So I was excited to hear that, because particularly the recreating what you heard. That way you really, both people really get the sense whether they align that they at least were heard, and that's just awesome. So I just wanted to tip my hat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions from satellite? Yeah, Cole Valley. Did you?
Yes, I'm curious about where you held your pop-up sessions.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Skokie has 2 floors for public access. The first floor has 2 entrances, which makes it a little bit challenging So we tried to have pop-ups along main walkways, either close to either entrance. A lot of the pictures you're seeing are from are closer to our east entrance because there's a bit of an opening. There's also a built-in table, and usually we have a display around there as well, but it's a really good position for people going in and out of the building. We have tried pop-ups that are more info literacy specific on our second floor, right at the top of the stairs. That's close to the reference desk before you get into like the stacks and the computer area and the seating area. And primarily adults and some high school students are using our second floor, but the first floor is going to see a mix of ages of patrons. So our favorite spot is that east gallery area. We've also tried it across from our reader services desk where we have a water court. Really nice light when it was winter to stand in the sun. It was really nice. And that way too, when you're popping up in different areas, it's helping spread the message to your community that these events are happening, and hopefully they'll recognize it as a way, they'll recognize it and then be like, oh yeah, I'll participate. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
A follow-up, what was your numbers for your together at the table, and how did you recruit people to the table?
That's a great question. So numbers are 120. Again, that's a day-long event. We advertise this in our newsletter, on our website. I think at some point too, we had people out. So has anyone been to Skokie? Okay, so some of you might know what I'm talking about. From the east entrance, you walk into the library like through a doorway. And then this program room is off to the left. So we would have staff pop out and be like, hey, this is happening, would you like to join us? So because of how our meeting room spaces are, it takes a little bit more staff involvement to kind of recruit the day of, but that's where teen volunteers can come in handy, having like t-shirts too, so you're recognizable as a trusted library staff person, rather than being like, hey, you want to have a muffin in here? Don't do that.
So it do the PA announcements.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Handy dandy PA announcements. So
thank you. Other questions? Sorry.
So it sounds like there's a lot of staff involvement, so it's not just you all. So I'm just wondering how you go about training. Is there like point of service facilitation training so that people that are at the service desks are aware of what you all are doing and can anticipate questions and that sort of thing?
We're actually going to get to a little bit of how to engage and involve staff. So if you're okay, if we don't answer your question at that point, then we'll have time at the end.
Okay. Yeah. So you had mentioned in your first foray into Civic Lab that it wasn't in the best spot. So then you had transitioned into doing pop-ups. In a perfect world, if you had a great spot, what would you have preferred? Do you like doing the pop-ups better than the?
Absolutely. Yeah. The pop-ups are actually key to that, as opposed to being a passive or static exhibit. Mm-hmm. We've discovered that for our patrons, they really respond to having a staff member there live in person to take their questions, to ask them questions, to show them materials, to say that, well, we're talking about this today. And even if someone doesn't necessarily want to talk, the fact that there's others around and congregating around this area to talk about something might lead them to be interested a little more, to stop, to maybe scrawl a note on a Post-it and stick it to the question that we've asked for that day. We found the facilitation part is key because it also lends some more opportunity to teach those information seeking and verifying skills that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I maybe wasn't as clear with the Civic Lab too. There are multiple ways of engaging, so you can be in it. We have several patrons who look at the calendar, they find out when these are happening, and they come and they're ready to get down and talk. Then you have some people who are passing by and they might ask, like, what is this? And you can explain it to them. Maybe they're not going to participate that day, but now they're more aware. Then you have like your lurkers a little bit farther away where they're like, I'm skeptical of this, but maybe they're going to take a handout and you can offer it to them, or they're going to do the Post-it response too. So we try to have different ways to spread the word that these are happening and to also invite people in.
How long are the pop-ups up?
So they range from 1 to 2 hours.
But just one day a month? Or is it?
I also forgot to mention that. So we have 2 topics a month that are generally popping up twice in that month. So we'll pick a week. I might pop up Tuesday morning and then Wednesday evening. And then Mimosa is going to be later that month, and she might choose different days. So we've gathered data. Well, Amy has gathered data from all of our past pop-ups to figure out really good times to go and not so great times to go. Sometimes we relate the pop-up to another event that's happening. So as people are coming out or before they're going into a program, we're there. Mimosa has done a really great job on that.
So we're actually having, our library participates annually in the YWCA's annual across the country Stand Against Racism, in which we go outside for about 25 minutes and show our solidarity and support as an institution for being against racism. But one of the things we discovered in the process of doing that, whether you're staff or patrons, is that what does it actually mean to stand against racism? What does allyship look like? And so in response to that, we are developing a pop-up in which we ask people, well, what does it mean to stand against racism? In which we provide some resources and then actually have some conversation with individuals who either participated in the stand or just people who are passing by through the library that day to talk about strategies as well as present resources like we do with any pop-up, but it's also very much connected to creating some further discussion as opposed to just being up there with your sign and then leaving.
So in total, we'll have 4 scheduled pop-ups a month and at least 2 rapid responses. So it's about 6.
Can you estimate about how much time you put into the, a month's worth of pop-ups and how many people roughly are involved on a regular basis?
So for each curated pop-up, it's 2 staff members who are working together. The time you put in ranges on kind of like the narratives of gun violence that I'm working on. It's taking me a lot of time because I'm going to get it right. So I'm probably spending, or should be spending, about an hour a week. And I'll take about a month to get the resources in. Some go a little bit more quickly, so when we've done like how a bill becomes a law, that's readily available information, so the time that you're going to put into it is getting additional resources related to that topic. I think it varies on the person too.
Yeah, I mean, I have been continuing my own information seeking and knowledge building, but there are some topics that I just don't have enough of a confidence about. So we're going to do an upcoming pop-up on the attempted neo-Nazi march in Skokie, and while I know about it, and our library has a wonderful digital exhibit related to it, we want to pop up and talk about it in terms of its anniversary and the effects it has had on our community today. And so I feel like I don't have as good of a grasp on it, and so I will spend another, I should have spent an hour each week. I'm going to actually spend an additional hour this week to get my sources right, to make sure that I have all the information. And I am working with another person, so that helps to take away more from the burden off of myself.
And our team meets about every 6 weeks. We also use Basecamp as a project management tool where we're putting everything that we're working on there. We can ask questions that way, so it doesn't necessarily involve face-to-face time. It can also involve just as part of your checking your other projects or you're checking your email, you can communicate that way. And yeah.
I wanted to add too, for those curated handouts, all of those handouts do have to go through our formal proofreading process at the library. So handouts need to be done at least 1 week before the pop-up so that they have time to go through that process, be formatted. I'm the one who formats every single handout, which I'm down to that taking me about 20 minutes. Each time, but still that's something to factor in. And because of that lead time of a week for those curated handouts, that's one of the reasons why those rapid response pop-ups, we have that standard go-to news sources handout. It helps us actually accomplish what we want to do in rapid responses, but it also, we don't have to create a new thing each time, it's done. So that's a way to kind of cut down on some of the perhaps planning time And we've started to identify over the last year and a half of doing Civic Lab pop-ups what topics are, quote unquote, evergreen, so that we could easily pop up again. And things like how a bill becomes a law, we've done multiple times now because it is always relevant. Resources are ready to go. People are always interested.
Other questions? Okay, let's go you first.
Have you thought about taking the idea of the pop-up off-site, and if you have, what sorts of places have you gone?
Yes. So we would love to get out into the community to have some civic engagement. One idea we're thinking about starting with is our Village Green area, which is an outdoor space right between the library and Village Hall. So it would be easier to take all of our bins that can be on a cart to go there. But one thing that we have started is we've connected with one of the local junior high schools, and they have asked to adopt the Civic Lab model into their school. They use the logo. We have Amy made a handout template for them too, so they're doing similar things, and it's student run by their social justice club, and they're popping up about once every other month right now. Activities relate back to curriculum. So the media school media specialist, Tori, has been getting buy-in, from not just her students. That was pretty easy, but now she's getting it with faculty. And so her goal for the next year is to have them pop up once a month, and again have something relevant to what the Social Justice Club is doing, and also tie into curriculum. So we consider that like getting out in the community, and maybe other schools will follow suit. We've gotten suggestions that we should go to Old Orchard Mall. My car's not big enough for those bins, so we'll have to figure out how to, reformat what we do. But we're thinking about that. That's something that's aspirational. You had a question, yes?
I had a question, and I don't know if this is going to come up in the next session, but more about the reflective listening, and I think it's great. I'm just curious if when someone is repeating something back, if that also opens up an opportunity for someone to be like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I could also see that as like a place for friction.
So one of the things, I've only done it twice now. I've either been part of, actually facilitating or observing. And what I've noticed is that people are, for the most part, fairly respectful, and they will say, well, I disagree with you. And yes, one of the things we try to coach people through is that, you might have something really urgent to say, but what you're gonna do for this time, this space, is you're going to focus on what that person's words are that are coming out of their mouth. And then in order to be reflective about it, it's that process of repeating back and then thinking about, well, what do I say in response to that? And I really think that because we are sitting in a group, we're looking at each other, we have some coffee and some tea and cookies, that we have created this environment in which people are more likely to be less like, okay, I'm gonna write the worst comment ever and post it on your wall. It's not gonna be like that antagonistic. So we try to set the example too through ground rules. Some of these ground rules were adapted from the YWCA, who we partner with for Let's Talk at Lunch, in which we express to people who are participating in these monthly conversations about issues related to equity and race and racism, that anything that you say in this room, it's purely from your own experience. You don't speak for others. You'll be respectful in critiquing ideas and not the person, and that we really advocate for adhering to the guidelines of the library's appropriate use policy, in which you are respectful towards everyone when you come in through the door.
Do you use those ground rules at the pop-up? That's where I could see you getting stuck with a person who's just going to manipulate your time, someone else coming in, and it getting a little hairy.
Yeah. Internally, yes, I think as facilitators, but Amy has become really good at redirecting the conversation when it can get. Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So as Amy mentioned, she likes to do a lot of science topics, and I'm super into science too. Science is real, side note. I speak for myself, not Skokie Public Library, although information is real, so there you go. Draw your own conclusions. So we were talking about genetic editing, and a patron came up and wanted to talk about vaccination and how isn't vaccination terrible and wrong, and can you believe how many vaccines kids get these days? I only had to get this many. Can you imagine why that is? And I was like, well, the chickenpox vaccine didn't exist when I was little, so I know they've added that one. Like, let's look up some information and like get some stats on when they've changed. And he was a little like, oh, like there's a response. But then also like as he started saying, well, what about this perspective? And it was something I had not been familiar with before. And so what I did was again reorient toward the information and resource and say, I've not heard this perspective before. Where are you getting this information? I'd like to find out more. So there will occasionally be people who, I don't think antagonistically, but just in how they're approaching it, they're like, I want to maybe see if you can see that I think you're wrong, or to show you this source that I think is really real. And at the end of the day, like what I'm doing and what I'm trying to help other staff really get up to do is be able to say, that's interesting. I've not heard that before. Where can I find out more? Had you heard about this perspective? No, here's where you can find out more. And just redrawing it back to that, like we're not here to come to a conclusion today. We're here to find good resources and then go our own way, think about it, make up our minds.
The other side of that too is we have, like I mentioned, we have these patrons who seek Civic Lab pop-ups out, and they often demand a lot of your attention. So it's more facilitation skills there to be like, that's interesting. Why don't you talk to this person about it? So then you can pivot and welcome more people in. So I have found that if I tuck myself into like the back of my setup, then that is a problem for more, other people who might be coming later, that I won't be as available to them. So I try to exit the circle as possible. You can circle other patrons up and still have an ear, or you have the other staff lead there too. But we have like these two kind of reoccurring, not issues, but just experiences that happen with these types of events.
Did we have any questions from our partners in East Peoria or Aurora or Coal Valley or New Lenox so far? Anything? Okay.
All right. So let's go ahead and move on to the last little bit of hearing from us before time for you guys to ideate. So some thoughts on intended audience. Hopefully it's clear at this point that we do consider civic engagement an all ages affair at Skokie Public Library. We all have different areas of expertise when it comes to working with different age audiences. And so we've kind of, again, over the course of the last year and a half, really learned some tips and tricks for engaging different ages. So for me, coming from a youth librarian perspective, it should not come as a surprise to anyone that like an aspect of fun should underlie everything that's going on. Granted, that is a whole lot harder when we have topics like gun violence. But for things like one of my favorites that tied in kind of a sense of being personally relatable, and also that gamification we talked a bit about, was last year for Women's History Month in March. We did Actually She Did That. Intentional use of the word actually. And basically that entire pop-up was around the idea of historically there are women who have achieved these really remarkable things, and either someone else, usually a dude, gets credit for it, or they were better known for something else. So what we did to really engage all ages is have headshots, images of 10 women from pretty much the last 150 years, with their name and the dates that they were born and if they had died when they died, and then asking people to come and match that woman with an accomplishment. Oftentimes accomplishments people didn't know about. So like one example is, this woman discovered the double helix structure of DNA, and Crick and Watson got a Nobel Prize for it. That's Rosalind Franklin. And so this was like a gamified way to really help convey the point that we were trying to make there. And again, this is another kind of evergreen topic that like people, particularly women, particularly people of color, tend not to get recognition for their accomplishments in like the annals of history. And so this is something that we can help to at least raise awareness of the fact of this disproportionate recognition. So that engaged a lot of kids, in particular a lot of girls who were like, one of the discussion questions we had was, how would you feel if someone else got credit for something you did? and more specifically for some of the young girls, how would you feel if a boy got credit for what you did? And like that really connected it, made it personal, and really it kind of exploded that learning for those kids. So it was fun because there was a game aspect, but it was also really personally relevant. So we're always looking at ways to do that when working with kids. For example, with the kids' news discussion groups, we've had some weather issues and had to cancel a couple of them, but when we've done it, like one of the first ones looked at just at the topic of what is fake news. And the way our facilitator, who's in the youth department, really framed that in the discussion with kids is like, so what does fake news mean to you? And a lot of kids are saying, oh, it's like gossip or rumors, something that they're totally familiar with at the fourth grade level. And that helps put it into a personal context so they can understand what's going on. So for kids, that gamification and like making it personally relatable are really important.
And with teens, it's similar, but the personally relevant aspect is a heavier hand when you're working with teens, because otherwise they are just going to ignore you. So one method we use is we know teens' names, so having a relationship with them, even if it's just you know their name and maybe what grade they're in, that is really helpful. I love this picture because the two teens that I recruited to this pop-up look so uncomfortable. But they came and they stayed for a really long time. They were engaging with our, not only the Civic Lab team facilitators, but also our guest staff facilitator. This is Do You Stand with Standing Rock, and Matt, who's kind of the forefront of this image, had demonstrated there, so he was sharing his experience, and they were totally into it. And then we also had another teen who came over because I knew her name, and I said, hey, are you learning about this in school? And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then when she learned a little bit more, because I took the time to have a conversation with her and gave her my attention, she was like, whoa, wait a minute, this is really happening. And she took that handout back to school, basically demanded more information because they weren't talking about these relevant news topics in schools. And like, that's a win for us, right? When we popped up on net neutrality, I had a group of high school students just kind of hanging out where I was, and that is also a topic that you can personally relate to their everyday experiences, talking about like, how would you like it if you couldn't get onto Netflix because of where you live or because of what device, like all these other things. So having some sort of avenue to approach the topic in a way that they're like, oh, wait a minute, this is all about me. Yeah, I care now. With the news discussion group, the Media Wants Your Brains, like I mentioned, that is totally gamified. Jarrett, our teen librarian, does a really good job of having those components, but also a way to reel that in, because it can get a little munch, and make sure that there is also reflection going on and discussion. But knowing the timing of it with teens is helpful too. Like, you can't just start off with that. Like, you got to ease into it and have them kind of come to the conclusions. This happens with adults too, where they're like, yeah, that was my idea. It's the same with teens. Like, they need to have that revelation and then share it, and you're like, you're absolutely right. Let's move from there.
And to say the same thing with adults, they're versions of teens and youth, and that they really appreciate the fact that we are trying to tie in something with that, things that are relevant in their lives. So oftentimes I might have an adult patron come to this and pop up and be like, what is this? You know, and then we explain, well, we're the Civic Lab and we're here asking this question today about what is FEMA, or what is, whose land is this land? So that was a pop-up we created in response to a patron who actually spoke with us about the idea of whether or not national parks and other lands should be returned, so to speak, to different indigenous organizations and tribes, just because of the sheer cost of maintaining them. And the person responded and said, are there indigenous organizations that are still in existence? I mean, I thought they disappeared. And we're like, nope, we have to really do something about that. So we created a pop-up in which we talked about different forms of indigenous resistance, as well as narratives and different documents that historicize their struggle, as well as the ways in which our government has recognized, whether on a federal level or on a state level, different tribes. But What we try to do for adults is we try to provide intellectually stimulating conversation points that can be related back to their personal and or professional experiences. We also try to really continue the engagement with other resources that we've made available, whether that's books or movies, to show them, hey, this is another way you can continue your learning on an informal basis. You don't have to be an expert. A lot of times adults, they're pressed for time. They don't necessarily know, how does this relate to anything? And I need a really clear, concise objective with regards to this. And the nature of the Civic Lab is it doesn't seem like it has a concise objective, but indeed the objective is, hey, we want you to learn a little more about a certain topic, and here's how you can find that information if you want to learn this yourself. And so really we're trying to really just tie it back to where they are, but also give them the tools, give them the opportunity to explore on their own, use that independence that they've cultivated, whether by necessity or desire, and to build upon that. And that really ties well with our staff member here in this image, one image back. So if you see at the center, our colleague Matt, he's a bookmobile librarian, but he had also taken time to go to the protests at Standing Rock and witness and be part of what was happening in 2016.
On his own time, not for the library, just FYI.
Yes, as a citizen, as a private citizen. And he came back and was a wonderful resource in talking about what actually happened at Standing Rock, and was able to share out what compelled him, what drove him to be part of that, and then what has he taken back at coming back to the library in his daily job.
So it's a great segue to that piece of like, how do you prepare staff, both just so they're aware, but also so they feel like they have the training competencies to be able to engage with patrons in this way. In terms of general staff awareness, one of the huge benefits of having the Civic Lab pop up in public spaces of the library is that staff are moving through the library all the time. And so actually probably, between 10 and 15% of our participants at any given pop-up are actually staff members who come by to see, oh, hey, what are you talking about today? Can I see the handout? Oh, did you read this? And, they'll end up talking to other patrons or sometimes just to us as staff, but really that's helped pretty much everyone who's been at the library for a decent amount of time at this point is familiar with the Civic Lab in concept. So if they're at the checkout desk and we're not too far away doing a pop-up and a patron asks them, hey, what's this? They're able to answer that question. In terms of actually making sure that staff who are going to be facilitating or helping develop these things, how do we ensure that they're prepared? A lot of that has fallen to us as kind of the folks who've been doing the Civic Lab the longest. And a lot of that introductory material that we shared earlier this morning, we convey in conversations with staff who are coming on either to be part of the Civic Lab curatorial team, someone who's going to facilitate a news discussion group, and it's really saying our main goal here is information and good information, and helping people get to that point of recognizing, okay, at the end of the day, this is about having good information resources. That is my goal. If I get in a conversation that I feel kind of flummoxed by how did I get here, like redirecting it to information. So I can't stress enough with these new staff participants, but also with you, that having that clearly stated goal for civic engagement is so, so important for staff feeling prepared and also supported. We also, in particular, when staff are starting to think about making pop-ups, making handouts, making some of these resources to share, going kind of through the exercise of, all right, so let's make sure we're all really clear on what is news, what is analysis, and what is opinion. So one of the handouts we shared with you is what is journalism and what isn't. That's one that we used for a Civic Lab pop-up for the public, but it basically also follows the line of thinking that we use when we're bringing in new staff members who might feel like, all right, how do I know what I should include? Being able to have staff feel confident and being able to differentiate between like what is actual news coverage, what is actual analysis, and what is opinion, and making sure that a well-resourced handout isn't going to be all opinion. will likely benefit from having a good amount of analysis. So that's reporting with an expert perspective. That's been really useful. The other piece, and our go-to news sources handout really ties in here as well, is having conversations with staff members. What are your own personal news habits, proclivities, and with that, kind of some of the biases. We all have them. All news sources, like, truth be told, are likely going to have some type of bias, and that's increasingly so as, like, fewer and fewer media companies own more and more of the, like, main news outlets. Shout out if anybody listens to the Daily podcast from the New York Times this morning talking about Sinclair. So that was just really interesting. And I'm thinking we might have some sort of pop up about who owns your news, because really important for people to know about, right? Yeah, go.
So oftentimes when we're coming up with topics and deciding who's going to staff what, if something is a personal trigger for a staff member, they usually don't participate. And our team is pretty cognizant of that and saying, you know what, a little too close to home for me, I'm not gonna volunteer for that one. Because as the curatorial team, we come up with ideas and then make assignments. So that's something to also be aware of when you are preparing staff to take part in these things.
Yeah, so a big part of that preparation is like tapping on the expertise of our colleagues and leading with a culture of we always want people to feel open to saying, have you heard about, have you thought about, so that we're able to provide the richest information experience we can. So now we want to transfer to the small group exercise part here, where hopefully this will be really useful in helping you start to think about what your next moves could be at your library, both what topics are coming up, what are ways you could help address those topics with patrons, and then also think about who are some of the resources or partners who could be allies in creating those opportunities, potential obstacles, because it's always better to think about them in advance, and then who you can count on for support. And please include us in who you can count on for support. We'll share our contact information at the end. It's also on the handout. So we're going to take about 8 minutes, I know that's super quick, to chat with your neighbor, think about these things, write down your thoughts, and then we'll circle back and hear from a couple folks before time for closing questions. Go to it.
All right,
we're going to circle back.
Of that,
my position, how would I broach that conversation?
It's access to information.
It only
She
have
keeps
maybe
like coming back to
five
it.
minutes.
It's that we're professional.
Oh, really? Okay.
But it's
like,
tough.
and
Okay.
racism is bad.
Cool. Thank you for engaging in that exercise. We hope it is useful. We're curious to hear what things you may be inspired to think more about. May I say offer? Coming up based on some of the things you thought about here. Anyone? Or was this just a colossal waste of?
Well, what makes me, and I was thinking about this when you were giving your presentation, and then also discussing it with my colleague here from Schaumburg, just how each library, because of its different staff setup, like Skokie has a huge staff, Schaumburg has a huge staff. I work in a library where we serve 55,000 people, but we only have maybe 30 people full-time, and of those 30 people, maybe 5 are professional librarians. And so you have a lot of support staff who may not be at a level where they could do this kind of research and planning and presentation. And so it's very challenging because we don't have the manpower to put this into practice as successfully, I think. And it really does. I think it is a group effort. And when you make it a group effort, you're less likely to introduce bias, personal bias.
Yeah, that's totally true. And like, I want to reiterate, we started with basically the 3 of us. And until maybe 4 or 5 months ago, we had led 75, if not more, % of the pop-ups. That said, we had a lot of part-time staff from lots of different departments who had like tapped in to help on particular topics. So for instance, when we did a pop-up on executive orders and immigration after the first travel ban from the Trump administration in January of 2017, we wanted to look at, again, because our community has a lot of immigrants, like, is there precedence for this? And so we have one staff member who she and her family were incarcerated in a camp because they were of Japanese descent during World War II. So like, she didn't do anything besides like read over some of the resources one staff member had put together. Amy did. But then she was down there for the actual pop-up to be part of the conversation. So that's really how we started, getting people to, additional people beyond just the 3 of us to come in and help be part of the conversation. And then really we've been able to grow, including people who are not full-time librarians, who aren't librarians at all, because they have a personal interest in what we're trying to accomplish. So we got here through, we had to get t-shirts to bribe people to participate.
It's working.
It's working, yeah. So like, just because you're starting with a smaller staff, obviously there will be obstacles associated with that, but it's not like too high of a wall to get over.
And this is where like evergreen topics can be really helpful. So if you did adapt the model of the Civic Lab, you pick maybe 3 things that are of importance and that tie in directly with positions. So our adult services manager participates in one pop-up topic, and she's done it a couple of times with some of her staff, but it's related to information literacy and fake news. So it's completely relevant to her day-to-day job, and so the resources that she's coming up with also tie into that, and it's not as much of a perceived burden to develop those resources. And then it's the same kind of handout, and maybe you update your resources, which you should be doing anyway to do your job well. So you can maybe pick even one thing that is relevant and start with that and see how it goes.
Yeah, another recent example, I don't know how many people come to your library asking about tax forms, but we get a lot. And so there was a pop-up about like what are taxes and just talking about different tax systems. It ties into understanding how government in our country works, so it definitely tied in. What else? Anybody else? Thank you so much for sharing. Please consider us a resource to help.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to say that this was not at all a colossal waste of time. This
Oh,
was
good.
really very inspiring and a lot of practical, meaty stuff. So, and I liked, one of my takeaways is, I'm not really answering the question here.
That's fine.
the idea of, because I was thinking, that the gun control and gun violence, that's been a thing in our community and led largely by the youth, by the high school students. So I was thinking about, approaching those topics from a broader perspective and not so much the opposing viewpoints. I thought that was a very worthwhile point that you made there. And then I was thinking with that subject in particular, like maybe capitalizing on that youth momentum and turning that into more of a social, how to help teens become social activists. And there's a lot I think that libraries can do to, help that. So.
Yeah. And one of the first pop-ups that McCracken, the junior high school we partnered with, their first pop-up theme was, what is civic engagement? And so that kind of set the stage to, their students were developing the content for it. And then when it's a peer-to-peer learning and sharing model, I think that's more impactful for that age group. So maybe you can take a little bit of that and apply it to your teams.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything any of our satellite folks want to share, or we've only got like 9 minutes left now, so any closing questions?
How do you evaluate? What kind of tool are you using to evaluate these programs?
Yeah, so how do we evaluate? Is that my hat? Okay. So in some ways, we've not really figured out a great single evaluative tool just yet. As Amy alluded, I've looked at all of the stats of like how many people participate based on time of day. I haven't yet done day of the week. For a lot of pop-ups, we'll get between anywhere from like half a dozen to 3 dozen people. A lot of that has to do with like what was the weather outside. So that's kind of difficult. We're trying to think a little bit more broadly as like what types of conversations are we having and how often are we able to have conversations where someone leaves and says, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. Or, oh, I didn't know about that resource. I'm gonna look into that. Or like, oh, I'm still gonna watch MSNBC, but I'm also going to listen to this other thing to make sure that there's more. So trying to keep track of some of those indicators.
Have you looked at Project Outcome to see if they have anything?
Yeah, so we are hard in Project Outcome. Our former director helped to develop it, so either you're welcome or sorry. And so for their civic engagement survey, all of their surveys are really looking at, is there a change in knowledge, awareness, intended behavior? And so I think in a lot of ways those things do tie in. And I guess those are some of the indicators we're looking at, although we're not asking people who like come to a pop-up for 4 minutes to then fill out a survey, because they're not coming back after having to do that. But yeah, so looking at things like, have they expressed to us that like they've thought about something they haven't before, they're going to try a new resource. My favorite is when it's usually like a dude about my age who's like, oh, maybe I'll vote next time, like, duh. And so that's one of the things we're looking at more long-term, like what some of the voter turnout in Skokie over a number of elections. I've gone back. You can get your data by township, district, going back to, I think, 2008. So I have all those numbers, and I'm really curious to see what our next midterm election numbers look like. And then also I was at a great session at PLA talking about different metrics, and one thing they looked at, and it's really hard to quantify in any way, was like, has the tenor of the conversation changed? Like, are more people aware of a topic now in the community broadly because of a thing that ties into something that happened at the library? So I'm not quite sure how to measure that yet, but it's something we're thinking about.
Well, you could, at your pop-ups, you could have a laptop that has a very simple, maybe 1 or 2 question electronic survey question, that summarizes the, and you could also have it available on your website so that when at another time they could respond to that experience.
Yeah, those are great suggestions, and it's definitely something. Now our curatorial team is up to 9 people from just the 3 of us, for like a year and a half. So that frees up a little bit more to think about those pieces. And if we find something that seems to work, we will share that as well.
And we should add that for each pop-up, the leads do write up kind of an overview of what happens. So we include like attendance or participation, but also like these are our key things that we witnessed, or some really powerful reflections, which is how we got the quote about making informed decisions so someone doesn't make a decision for you. And any handwritten responses to our prompts. So from those post-its, we also write those up. And I think right now is a really good time for us to consider like a deep dive into that and see what, especially like the evergreen ones, if we've seen any changes across that. But surveying is also a really good tangible tool as well.
What's the response been from your board?
The response from our board has been, well, I don't know that they've actually said anything. And we did a year one report that went in the board report, and we didn't get any comments. So we kind of take that as like, all right, cool, going.
Good. Administration is positive, like they are very supportive, they'll participate. In the images from Together at the Table, you'll see our director, you'll see our deputy director. So I feel like that's a really positive sign too.
Yeah. Any questions from Aurora, New Lenox, East Peoria? Okay, thumbs up, thank you.
Yes. In the beginning, you had a slide with the books that changed your lives.
Yeah.
Can you say which ones those were? I'm curious.
Oh, sure.
I saw the Gloria Steinem one.
Oh. Yeah, so that.
I need to see it.
Oh, our like intro for people who couldn't see us, our faces, books that changed our lives. For me, the one I picked was by Gloria Steinem. I can't even remember what it's called now. Outrageous Acts in Everyday Rebellion. So it was a collection of some of her essays that I read in middle school. Yep, I was that kid. And just like, oh, there are lots of ways to look at the world, and a woman's experience isn't often the one at the forefront of what's portrayed. So that was big for me.
What was your what's yours, Amy? I can't see it.
Mine is Being Mortal by, thank you. Can you say it louder?
Atul Gawande.
Yes. So I read that at a pretty critical point in my life, just with some personal things, and I found it really helpful as a tool to put things into perspective and then to help you move on, but also prepare for other things. So I strongly recommend that if you have people in your lives.
So mine is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, and I read it shortly after it was published. I read it in 2008. I had just returned from a stint being abroad, and I was at the time trying to figure out what direction I wanted to go in next, because I had been unemployed at the time, and I had taken a temporary job, and I was assigned to be a receptionist, and they told me to read at the desk. So I brought that book with me and read it all in one day, and was really moved by the examples of the characters and how it seemed like they were always making bad choices. And more importantly, I was really touched and inspired to be more involved and engaged civically through that book, and the different struggles that each of the characters had, whether it was personal, but the personal is political. And that really motivated me to get up and look for work that wasn't a receptionist job. And so I eventually started working for political campaigns at the not the national level, it was at the state level. But it was really interesting, exciting work that took a lot out of me, but I learned a lot. And so that was the book. So.
Cool. We've put up on the main slide our contact information. It's also got the link to the Civic Lab webpage of the Kentucky Public Library website. We link all of our handouts within each event of what we've done in the past. So if you want to explore more, you can do that there. You can contact us with questions or to get more resources. Thank you all so much.
Thank
you. You can always visit.
Thank you so much, Amy and Amy and Melissa. We really appreciate your time and sharing this today. And I really appreciate everybody's participation and for coming out today. And looking forward to continuing the conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, New Lenox. Bye, Aurora. Bye, East Peoria.
Whole Valley has lunch.